It's Sunday, June 15th, 2025, and we're expecting widespread storms across the United States today, with a focus on North Carolina and Virginia out here in the mid Atlantic, the southern plains, the central plains, and especially the northern plains. The Storm Prediction Center has actually gone ahead and issued a enhanced risk up here in southeastern Montana, with a slight risk stretching down here into the central plains all the way into Nebraska and northeastern Colorado. And then they've issued a marginal risk of severe weather stretching almost the entire plains, except we have one area of not really severe storms expected out here associated with a mesoscale convective system that's really stabilized all the air out here, but is expected to push into eastern to central Texas this morning. Like the past couple of days, this is going to almost be an entirely wind field threat with a 30% hatched moderate risk of wind up here in southeastern Montana, and then a 15% slight risk of wind stretching down here into the western central plains. And the rest of our risk areas have a 5% marginal risk of severe winds. And our hail, although not as widespread, we could still see up to 3-inch hail today up here in central to southeastern Montana. That's why the SPC has issued a 30% hatched moderate risk for very large hail out here in this region, with an associated 15% slight risk of hail out here stretching down into the western central plains. And the rest of our risk area is going to have a smaller risk for large hail as well. And lastly, we have a 2% marginal risk of tornadoes out here in our western central to northern plains risk area, as well as our mid-Atlantic risk area. And something worth looking at is we have a day 2 enhanced risk of severe weather, which is definitely more rare this time of year. And this is going to be fueled by a mostly wind risk and a risk of very large hail, with a more robust risk of tornadoes down in southern to central Minnesota. And this weather pattern is still expected to linger for a bit. We have a day 3 slight risk, and then we have a day 4 and 5, 15% slight risk of severe weather as well. Here's our main risk area up here in central to southeastern Montana. And what we notice is that we're starting to see storms bubble up here around lunchtime or midday. These are going to pose that threat for strong winds and large hail. Then our main cluster of storms is really going to evolve and start to build up in the mid to later afternoon. These are going to pose that threat for mostly strong winds and large hail and the possibility of a tornado. And these are going to push eastward across Montana with a tad bit of disorganizing, but the low level jet looks like it's going to come in and save these storms and really make them into their strongest state around evening. And that's when we're going to see that threat for damaging winds and very large hail really maximize out here in this region. Then the low level jet could also possibly initiate storms further west. And another thing to notice down here in southeastern Montana to northeastern Wyoming, ARRR is actually expecting a pretty robust storm cluster to evolve down here in the evening hours, which will bring that all hazards risk in its earlier stages. But it looks like it's actually going to maximize in strength out here in northwest South Dakota, where it could bring large hail and damaging winds. Looking more south into our central plains risk area, we see storm clusters initiate along our high plains convergence zone, also around midday or lunchtime, with that favorable southeasterly flow into these storms. And these are definitely going to have a harder time because of the more capped environment out here in this region. And they're not really expected to mature until late afternoon. But when they do mature, they actually form into a pretty robust line of storms with even a bowing sort of line of nature, which is indicative of that high wind threat and no threat that these storms bring, as well as a very small risk for spin up tornadoes on this line. And these are expected to push eastward through northeastern Colorado, Nebraska, and even into Kansas, but they're actually expected to sort of die into the evening hours. Another thing to notice is this somewhat robust line of storms out here in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. This looks like it's actually going to strengthen and reach their peak in the late afternoon hours, bringing that mostly wind and hail threat. And I'm going to say actually a very, very small risk of tornadoes out here with these storms. And these are actually also going to die into the evening hours. Our second to last area of interest out here is going to be our southern plains area. And here is that mesoscale convective system pushing south and southeasternly. And this is what stabilized that air back here in northern Oklahoma and Kansas, which kind of diminished that risk for storms out there altogether. And in the morning hours actually re-intensifies with the help of that low level jet. and that southerly flow right into the storm. But by midday, it's pretty much entirely disorganized, with a small period of re-strengthening when it crashes into this storm cluster initiated by the clashing of the coastal air masses back here. But right after that, into the later afternoon and evening hours, it pretty much diminishes and does nothing altogether. But on that note, out here in the evening hours along our converging air masses out here in eastern New Mexico and western Texas, aided by the low level jet, we get some convection out here, which looks like it could actually be somewhat strengthened out here by that outflow boundary left by our MCS earlier. But because of the capping and high base nature of these storms, they're mostly going to produce that wind threat and hail threat only. And it looks like they'll die pretty quickly into the evening hours. And something to note is that if these storms out here can't latch onto that outflow boundary, there may actually be really no severe weather potential out here altogether in the southern plains. And then our last risk area out here in the mid-Atlantic near Virginia Beach is going to be associated with a trough digging down here and a low up here. As I move forward into the radar, you can actually see that low spinning quite a bit. And then also an assistive boundary up here is going to help initiate storms, which could bring that all hazards risk as they form into a cluster in the evening hours right here of that damaging wind threat, small hail, and even the conditional risk for a tornado or two. Here's our upper air maps, and we can actually see some ridging persisting over this region, which is going to be one of the causes for storms having a tougher time developing and strengthening out here in this region. But we do see it provide some upper air forcing for storms into the evening hours out here in northwestern Texas. And out here in the mid-Atlantic, we can see that shortwave trough digging in, and then that conducive westerly flow for storms out here today. But back into our main risk area, we can see our jet stream, which is actually going to be kind of squeezed by this high pressure system down here, which is going to help to accelerate it a bit and provide that large scale forcing for storms up here. And as a shortwave kind of overspreads our risk area today, that's when we're expecting to see the most convection out here in front of our jet stream, with storms having some of that discrete structure, which can foster that more hazards risk much better than, for example, a line of storms. Here's a sounding from our Central Plains risk area, and the first thing we notice is that our deep layer and low level shear are not really there at all, which would normally tell us that these storms aren't really going to be powerful at all today. But our thermodynamics are painting a bit of a different story. We see some veering in our winds, helping to spin those updrafts. We see higher lowest cloud levels, which is indicative of a higher wind threat. Our lapse rates are really good at 9.4 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. We see some drier loft, which can help to accelerate those downdrafts and create that threat for damaging winds. We see high amounts of cape or lift in the atmosphere up here near our freezing level, which could help produce some large hail out here in this region. And then although our precipitable water is kind of low, our downdraft cape is going to be pretty good at over 1400. Now, even though our thermos look pretty formidable, this is all going to be hindered by our lack of organizing bulk shear down here. We can see that we only have 17 kilometers an hour of bulk shear. And normally what we look for is above that 40 kilometers an hour line. So that is why these storms are going to struggle to organize and produce these hazards despite these really good thermos. Another thing we notice is a larger amount of capping in this region. And this trend of capping increasing and bulk shear decreasing is only going to continue the further south we go into our risk area. Here's a weather sounding from our main risk area, and immediately we notice that our bulk shear is going to be much better. We have over 50 knots of bulk shear up here, which is going to help to spin those updrafts and create that risk for large hail, damaging winds, and just an overall more organized storm structure up here. We see some veering in our winds, which is going to help to spin those updrafts. We see higher lowest cloud levels, which is going to help to increase that wind threat, as long as really good low level lapse rates. And our lapse rates up here are going to be 8.8 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, which is definitely good. We see some drier loft helping to accelerate those updrafts and provide lift for these storms. We see a fairly moist environment and definitely super solid cape for this region, eclipsing 3600, and a big pocket of that being around our freezing layer, which is going to help increase that risk for large hail. And then we see a lower precipitable water at 1.18 inches, and our downdraft cape is going to be pretty decent at over 1100. So these thermodynamics mixed with this large amount of bulk shear, which indicates our strong spinning updrafts, is definitely going to help produce that mainly damaging wind and large hail threat, with a very, very small threat for tornadoes. And that is going to be mostly associated with storms in that period where the low level jet ramps up and when they can kind of latch to that surface boundary out here.